I'm Anisa Mehdi with an Abraham Path Cultural Capsule. My guest is writer and scholar David W. Lesch. He is Ewing Halsell Distinguished Professor of History in the Department of History at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, and is author of 17 books. David is involved in diplomacy. He's been an advisor to each president for the last 4 administrations, from President Bush to President Biden. And he's just come out with a new book, A History of the Middle East Since the Rise of Islam. Welcome, David.
Oh, pleasure to be here, Anisa. Good to see you.
It's good to see you too. And I don't want to leave out that you were the #1 draft pick of the Los Angeles Dodgers in the 1980 winter baseball draft as a pitcher. And you were a player before an injury to your rotator cuff made you stop. I just think that's an amazing subject switch. A lot of people who were in sports, they become a manager, they become a writer, they become an announcer once they can't play the game. You chose the Middle East?
Yeah, all Middle East scholars are former minor league players. Didn't you know that? No, it is quite a change. And I think it just has to do with, in many cases, I went back to undergraduate school after I was released from the Los Angeles Dodgers after my injury. And a couple of professors just turned me on. Lou Cantori and Robert Friedman were Middle East professors at the University of Maryland, where I went back to school as an undergraduate. I took a few of their classes. And at the time, in the early 1980s, there was so much, there's always a lot going on in the Middle East, but at that particular time, you had the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, you had the Iranian Revolution, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, 82. So I was always interested in international affairs, and so I just kind of migrated with the help of those 2 wonderful professors toward the Middle East.
Well, to you, it may sound like a natural migration. I think it will surprise some of the people listening to us, because there's a lot of international out there, but why take on anything that isn't one of the most difficult challenges, right?
Yeah, it is. And I guess because at that time, I mean, this is, 40 years ago, certainly in the West, there just was so much misperception and misunderstanding about the region. And, through my studies and through these professors and so forth at the time, I kind of understood that and saw that as an area, an opening to really add to the West's knowledge of certain aspects about Middle East history.
David, I have often referred to the Middle East by Southwest Asia because it's geographic and maybe has a little less of the, the political baggage that Middle East has. What is your thought on that geographic terminology?
I have a whole discussion on why we call it the Middle East, how it came to that: Near East, Middle East, Southwest Asia, North Africa, Middle East, North Africa. What do we call it? And the Orientalism behind that. And I kind of make the reader aware that the name Middle East is the result of a point in time where it was very Eurocentric world that dictated the maps, and these names kind of held. And so just as long as the reader understands that these type of directions and north, south, east, west are really meaningless, because it's, if the people who are making the maps, instead of in Germany, in the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, were in China, where would the Middle East be? Maybe North America would be the Middle East, from their perspective. So I talk about all of that. And of course, if you go out into space, what really is north and south? How do we know that we're north and something is south, which obviously has sociocultural repercussions in terms of, the north being advanced and the south being below and not as advanced, and all that sort of thing. So I go into that discussion, but I end up by saying, I chose to use the Middle East because it's just as well known. A lot of people in the region use it. And I talk about a personal story of mine. I was in the Sultanate of Oman, and I was talking to the advisor to the foreign minister. It was back in the 90s. And I thought I would be, smart. And I said, these types of things in the Arabian Gulf, because many in the, from the Arab nationalist days in the 60s, they called the Persian Gulf the Arabian Gulf, not, or the Arab Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, rather than Persian Gulf. It was an Arab nationalist thing. And he looked at me and said, "Why did you say that?" I go, "Well, because of this." He goes, "No, don't say that. We all use Persian Gulf. We're over it. Don't worry about it." And so I end up saying in the book, with that level of acceptance, I'm using the term Middle East.
So that means that you had ideas. What are some of the early ideas?
Actually, this is where sports and athletics helped me quite a bit, because I understood right away that you need perseverance and a lot of patience, because any athlete will tell you you fail, most of the time, or at least half the time, and that's what makes you successful. And so after getting an introduction to the region and seeing how much failure there was, and how much failure was almost needed in order to produce positive steps in the right direction at times, I was drawn to that, in the sense that that's kind of how I developed as a person. That you need to have that perseverance, that resilience, and patience. And it's actually a nice segue to the API, because that's one of the things I recognized about the API right away. In my first conversation with William Ury, of course, the founder, one of the founders, we talked about all of this, and he talked about how this is a 500-year project that will go on long after we are all gone, and so I appreciate the incremental steps to making things better and getting things to the way that leads to success and positivity. And in the Middle East, certainly, it doesn't happen overnight, and you have to be resilient and persevere.
Well, that brings us perfectly, David, to your new book, A History of the Middle East Since the Rise of Islam. Take some context, look at the slow progress and what's happened, steps forward, steps backward. As you mentioned, there is failure involved, and frustration, and all of the emotions that go with it. But I will say there are a lot of books on the subject. They fill my bookshelf, they probably fill yours. We could name any number of authors. What do you bring to this subject that adds to the genre?
Yeah, look, I bring what I call the fidelity to the chain of history, in the sense that there are other books that cover this time period. All the ones I have, all the ones I researched before I wrote this one, and in every single one, about 1/3 of the book is on the entire medieval and early modern period in Islamic history or Middle East history, and then 2/3 of the book are on the 20th century and into the 21st century. And it's because I think they think that's what most people want, is more recent activity, more recent events, that people can relate to them more. But I think this does a disservice to the history. And so mine is much more equally weighted. I teach for 30 years, I've taught medieval Islamic history in the first semester and modern Middle East history in the second semester. There are two parts of the whole lower division courses. And I think for anyone to really understand Middle East history as a whole, you have to look at all of these periods with equal attention. And so that's what I do, I think, in my book. That's different than the other books that are out there. And so, you have 1/3 on medieval, 1/3 on early modern, 1/3 on the modern part. In fact, the modern part, I would love to just write, because I'm more of a modern Middle East historian than anything else. But I wrote the 18th through the 21st century as if I was 500 years from now, and looking back and writing what I think are the crucial moments, what I call the bent rails of history, why history went, in one direction and not the other. Because that's what we do when we look back 500 years, from now, back into the medieval and early modern period. So I think that's what is different, and I hope the readers appreciate that.
Could you mention one or two of these bent rails that sent us in some of the positive and negative directions that we're seeing here in 2023?
There are so many. One that just leapt to mind while you were asking me is the Caliph Abd al-Malik, an Umayyad Caliph that came into power at a very chaotic time in early medieval Islamic history.
Which would be approximately what years?
The 7th century, specifically in 685 CE. And there was, at the time, essentially a civil war within a civil war in the Islamic world that existed at that time. It was the growing pains of Islam. It was by trial and error, and they were trying to figure this whole thing out and what direction to go. And Abd al-Malik made a very, very important decision because he had the Byzantine Empire to his north. He was based in Damascus, Syria, which was the capital of the Umayyad Empire. And there was Ibn al-Zubayr, he was called, in Mecca and Medina, who was actually the most powerful entity at the time in the Islamic world, because the Umayyad Empire, because of these civil wars, had shrunk to just basically Syria. And Abd al-Malik made a decision. He said, you know, I have to accept a humiliating treaty with the Byzantine Empire to get them off my back so I can regroup and take on Ibn al-Zubayr down the road. And so he accepted this humiliating treaty. Basically, he was paying tribute to the Byzantine Empire to keep them off his back, and allowed him time. He bought himself time. And it turned out, long story short, that he was able to turn things around, defeat Ibn al-Zubayr, and consolidate Umayyad power. And he became then the model caliph for many, many caliphs down the road in terms of a centralization of power and reordering Islamic society. And in many ways, creating the environment for Islam to become, at that time, a truly distinct religion that separated it from its Judeo-Christian environment. And so you have this one decision basically taking one step backward, two steps forward, and connecting with our earlier discussion, you often have to do that in the Middle East and be resilient and persevere, where there's a case, Abd al-Malik, that changed certainly medieval Islamic history.
Indeed, and something worth considering,
Yeah,
probably in personal life as well as political and diplomatic life.
exactly.
You know, Islam is so much broader than what we today refer to as the Middle East. Why is the religion so important there? And does it show up differently there than some of the other areas where Islam is a majority religion? Because the influences of Christianity and Judaism are also profound.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. And I think, you know, because the Middle East is so connected to the origin story of this religion. And I think if you go to anywhere that's connected with the origin story, it tends to be a little bit different than where it ended up, and you know, halfway across the world. And this is what happens with any sort of religious diaspora or expansion, in that the more you expand, the more you inculcate local customs and local ideas and pre-existing belief systems. Even with Islam, as it spread out of Arabia with the early Islamic conquest shortly after the Prophet Muhammad died, it started when it spread into Byzantine areas, when it spread into Persian Sasanian Empire, former Persian Sasanian Empire areas, it began to inculcate and include elements of pre-existing belief systems, rituals, customs, traditions, ways of governance, you know, the way that the royal court was ordered, all of these things. And so I think, you know, the closer you get to the origin of something, it's almost as if it's more like how it started out. The more you spread, the more diffuse it gets. And it doesn't mean it's any better or worse. It just includes many more aspects of societies that, you know, predated Islam and had their own tremendous civilizations that were then in many ways assimilated into Islamic society.
Good point. Not destroyed, but assimilated.
Exactly.
Yeah. What was, we had mentioned there are other books that are in this arena. What was your biggest challenge writing this book?
It's the challenge in a 20, 30-minute podcast. It's putting about 10 hours worth of material into 20 or 30 minutes. The same with this book. Now, having said that, the book's about 474 pages long, everything included, including index, bibliography. But the main problem is what I call historical triage. when you look at this long period of time, I go back into the 500s, all the way, of course, to pretty much the present day. What do you include and what do you not include? And so I'm almost like what I call a secular priest. I come between the history and those who read it, and I determine what should be read and how it should be read. And so you have to leave out some things, unfortunately. I mean, I feel really bad about some, dynasties that and empires and individuals and movements that, I just made short shrift of, or just barely mentioned, or didn't mention at all. But you can't. One of the reasons I wrote this book was to have all-in-one shopping for students, so they don't have to buy 5 or 6 books and spend $200-300. They just need to spend whatever this book costs, $40-50, whatever, and everything is in there in hopefully an accessible, understandable way that combines depth and breadth. And I think I think I did, but I hope I found that sweet spot between depth and breadth to keep the page count down to a reasonable amount, which keeps the cost down to a reasonable amount. And so because of that, you have to perform this historical triage. And I know that, especially my fellow scholars, they'll be, anyone who reads this will say, oh God, I wish there was a little more on this, or wish a little more on that. And I probably agree with them, but you now you have a book of 1,000 pages long, and you've priced yourself out of the market, and you lose students and those who really want to learn about the Middle East in the minutia and the detail that is perhaps unnecessary at this introductory level.
And perhaps it will inspire people to do additional studies, and they'll look at your bibliography and get some good ideas, I'm sure, of where to go. So, but this is a textbook then in that sense, but it's more than a textbook. I mean, who else do you want to see reading this book, and what would they take from it?
I'd love the general public to read it. It's meant to be read by someone who has very little knowledge of the Middle East or Islamic history and wants to learn more, and is interested in international affairs and has some sort of passion in that area. And so I think this book, offers a lot in terms of the level of knowledge they want to learn, the level of knowledge they want to obtain in an accessible fashion. I keep using that term, accessible, because there's so many books that, especially written by scholars, and I've had to fight myself on that at times. You have to use the 5-cent word rather than the 25-cent word. You don't come to the main point of a crucial sentence and put it in Latin. A lot of scholars do, and it's like, why are you doing that? Just to show off or whatever. So I try to keep that in mind while offering the type of detail that I think is necessary and appropriate for someone who has very little or no exposure to Middle East history.
I bet it will also be helpful for those of us who think we know something about Middle East history.
I mean, there are fellow scholars have already, written me and said that, they never knew that, or a lot of scholars who focus on one area of Middle East history or the current time or something. And in fact, I know someone, a very good friend of ours who just read the book and has had more experience in the Middle East than just about anybody I know. I mean, he came back and said, I learned so much. My gosh, thanks so much for writing this. And so I think it's that breadth as well, because so many people, they have their silos and they focus in on their particular areas. And it helps a lot of time to have context, to have historical perspective that go back centuries, and that helps people understand things that are going on even at the current time.
And the current time, as complicated as it may be right now, will probably not become any less complicated in the years to come.
We always hope so. We're always trying, but sometimes it's 3 steps backward and instead of one, and then 1 step forward, then 1 step forward, then 1 step forward, just to get it back to equilibrium. So I think we may be at a point like that right now. But as you know well, sometimes out of crisis and war come opportunities and space for creative ideas for peace, stability, and prosperity, and that's what we can hope for.
We certainly will hope for that. A History of the Middle East Since the Rise of Islam by Dr. David Lesch, published by Oxford University Press. David Lesch, thank you so much for being with us.
All right, Anisa, pleasure to be with you. Thank you.